Thank you for the kind introduction. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming out to hear my talk on the Buddhist origins of Greek skepticism. This presentation will cover more than just the origins, or this would only be a 10-minute talk, as I will take you to some very interesting places where these influences ended up. And I bet a few of those places may shock you. I have formatted this presentation like a TED Talk as I take you on a journey of my accidental discovery of these Buddhist origins of skepticism. Briefly, a bit about me and how I made these connections. As mentioned by our host, I am an author who writes about the history of religion, and for the past several years I have been working on a book about how the world became secular. It occurred to me that it was only 425 years ago that Giordano Bruno was brutally burned at the stake by the Catholic Church for the crime of thinking, and yet 400 years later, Richard Dawkins is a global celebrity. That got me wondering how the world went from killing freethinkers to making them international stars in just a few hundred years. While my book starts in classical antiquity with the ancient Greeks who started challenging ideas of the gods and seeking to understand nature, and progresses chronologically through the ensuing eras, I started writing in the middle because of a book that was key to sparking the Enlightenment and the global impact it made. Before reading the book itself, I read Professor Stephen Nadler's historical summary of that book, A Book Forged in Hell. Nadler's title derives from a term used to denigrate the treatise by his 17th century European contemporaries, who were so shocked that this man dared to critique their religious traditions and Christian privileges. It was while reading Nadler's history of the outrage this book generated that I stumbled across a citation on page 6 that made me instantly stop and think, hey, there's something much deeper at play here. And this is the passage that made me go, all the things which regularly occur in ordinary life are empty and futile. I resolved at last to try to find out whether there was anything which would be the true good, capable of communicating itself, and which alone would affect the mind. Something which, once found and acquired, would continuously give me the greatest joy. Does this sound Buddhist in nature to any of you? Okay, so you are perceiving what I deduced. The connection was apparent as I studied Buddhism, though briefly in a university course on world religions, and I have lived in Asia for over 20 years in primarily Buddhist cultures. Reading this passage, the Buddhist elements jumped off the page and screamed to be acknowledged. For those of you who may be familiar with James Burke and his connections and earlier series, The Day the Universe Changed, you will see the influence Burke had on my writing style, as I like to look for interesting people and events, creating an entertaining yet informative narrative of how things are interconnected. Let's start with the first part of this citation. All the things which regularly occur in ordinary life are empty and futile. Or often phrased, life is empty and meaningless. Does anyone recognize this? A few of you. Now the harder question. Does anyone know where it comes from? This concept is known as the sunyata in Mahayana Buddhism. Further, the sunyata is encapsulated in the Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness, and the very emptiness is form. Let's jump to the bottom. The same is true of feelings, perceptions, impulses, and consciousness. Your consciousness, thoughts, and feelings are empty and meaningless. We humans assign meaning to things because our brains evolved to look for meaning where often there is none. There is no meaning of life. Life just is. While this can be very confrontational for the religious, it can be very freeing, as it was for me. And the 17th century philosopher who wrote the book that helped spark the Enlightenment was Benedict Spinoza. Note Professor Nadler's subtitle, Spinoza's Scandalous Treatise and the Birth of the Secular Age. And the book was the TTP, from the Latin Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, or in English, the Theological Political Treatise. The title tells you what the book is all about and why it so upset contemporary Christians, getting religion out of politics. Here, in another of Nadler's bios on Spinoza, you can see his evaluation of why the TTP is so important, because it is one of the most eloquent arguments for a secular, democratic state in the history of political thought. For those of you interested in the passage Nadler cited, it comes not from the TTP, but from Spinoza's treatise on the emendation of the intellect. So I emailed Professor Nadler and I asked him about this apparent Buddhism in Spinoza, and he replied, it is Greek Stoicism. I thought to myself, this is clearly Buddhist. This reply also revealed to me the danger of the logical fallacy of accepting arguments from authority, as Nadler is very much an authority on Spinoza. I could have accepted his answer of Stoicism and gone merrily on my way, but then I would have missed the deeper connections. Now, I can see why Nadler and others may think it's Stoicism, because the French philosopher Pierre Bayle, a younger contemporary of Spinoza, initially thought Spinoza was a Stoic, as he stated in his Historical and Critical Dictionary. I say initially because, as Professor Jonathan Israel notes, eventually Bayle realized the similarities were more apparent than real. Now, there is a very good reason why Stoicism was seen to be the influence, and we will get there in telling this story. My first step was to reach out to one of my university friends who is now a philosophy professor, and I asked him, are philosophers even aware Spinoza was a Buddhist? Is this something that is taught to philosophy students? He said he'd never heard that before, but he searched online and he found this article for me. As Professor Hong Ladaram points out, there are striking similarities, and yet it's surprising that it is not being widely discussed. The article goes on to note that only 3 academics in the past century have written about this. So I emailed Professor Hong Ladaram, and in another of life's quirky connections, we live in the same city and met for coffee to discuss these similarities. Professor Hong Ladaram generously loaned me his copy of Professor Edwin Curley's recent translation of the TTP, but more importantly, he directed me to a book written by one of his professors when he was a postgrad student, Chris Beckwith's Greek Buddha, a book that provides the key to our whole story. Note the subtitle, Pyrrho's Encounter with Early Buddhism, because Pyrrho is the Greek Buddha. Briefly, Pyrrho was a Greek philosopher traveling with the army of Alexander the Great during the invasion of the Indus Valley, where Pyrrho encountered Buddhism and brought it back to Greece, where it became known as Skepticism, or more accurately, a proto-skepticism, which derives from Buddha's rejection of absolutes that something is either true or false. To reject absolutes is to avoid attachments, which lead to suffering. Thus, Buddha advocates the reservation of judgment, or to be skeptical. Therefore, Buddhist reservation of judgment is the heart of skepticism and why it traces its origins back to Buddha. And so I associated Spinoza with Pyrrhonian skepticism. Pyrrho, as with Buddha, sought the middle ground between the dogmatic certainties of theists and the reasoning of the philosophers who believed our senses could provide the answers. This skeptical position was encapsulated in both Pyrrho's tripartite statement and in the Buddhist Trilaksana, which captures the 3 characteristics of dharma, ethics, impermanence, unpleasantness, and non-self, and Pyrrho's similar but not word-for-word translation, indifferent, unstable, and indeterminate. Further, Pyrrho notes, neither our senses nor our opinions are either true or false. They are merely opinions. As with the earlier Sunyata, your opinions are empty and meaningless, and you don't know what piece of information you will receive tomorrow that may change your mind. So, this basic premise of Pyrrho's philosophy, not to have any views, was a form of proto-skepticism that would be expanded by his followers in later generations into full-blown skepticism. Further, Beckwith highlights Pyrrhonism is both historically datable and clearly recognizable as a form of Buddhism. He is joined by Professor Thomas Machiavelli, an expert in the transmission of philosophical ideas, who notes that Pyrrho is the key evidence for this two-way sharing of ideas between Greece and India. Now, there are 2 core Pyrrhonist concepts. Firstly, let me point out the first noble truth of Buddhism. All life is suffering. It's better translated as struggle, but suffering is how it's most often described. So the first key ethic is apatheia, or the lack of suffering. Apatheia is attained by learning to master our states of mind and not to be swayed by our emotions. All life is unpleasant, and the key to peace of mind is to recognize the origins of suffering. Learning how to attain apatheia leads to achieving ataraxia, tranquility, or the Greek version of Buddhist nirvana. However, Pyrrho did not establish a formal school, but these 2 core concepts were incorporated by later men who did found their own schools. Let's recall what Spinoza wrote. Anything which would affect the mind, once found and acquired, would continuously give me the greatest joy. That sounds very much like apatheia leading to ataraxia. Adding in the Sunyata from the first part of this citation, we now have 2 very Buddhist ethics that become readily apparent when you know what to look for. And so, Zeno of Citium, the founder of the Stoic school, was one of the men who included these two core principles that became the central ethic of Stoicism and why, initially, Bayle thought Spinoza was a Stoic. However, there was another philosopher who incorporated these two concepts, Epicurus, and it's the Epicurean lineage that leads directly to the influence on Spinoza. While I wrote my chapter on Spinoza first, as I was writing my section on Epicurus, specifically reviewing his letter to Herodotus, I recognized that Spinoza was repeating practically verbatim all that Epicurus was asserting. So Spinoza was not just a Pyrrhonian skeptic, but very much an Epicurean one. In another of life's strange connections, I had this realization and Googled Spinoza and Epicurus, and Spinoza the Epicurean by Professor Vartalakis had been published only a few weeks earlier. I emailed Professor Vartalakis, who was kind enough to send me a copy of his book, and we exchanged multiple emails where he helped me to crystallize my summary and corrected a few places where he felt my interpretation was slightly off. We also did a podcast together about a year ago discussing these connections. The TTP was influential on the Enlightenment, and there is another famous Enlightenment thinker who was also an American founding father, Thomas Jefferson, who admits in this letter that he is also an Epicurean. And the most famous document Jefferson wrote was the Declaration of Independence, which includes the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And knowing Jefferson's Epicurean admission, if we switch happiness for tranquility, suddenly Buddhist nirvana appears in the Declaration. As I said at the start, the Buddhist influences would take us to some shocking places. In an interesting twist of fate, the skeptics took over Plato's academy after his death. Now, Plato was very theistic, and as you can see depicted in the two central figures of Raphael's School of Athens, which hangs in the Vatican, Aristotle is gesturing to the ground because he was interested in earthly concerns and understanding nature. But Plato is pointing to the heavens, and the book he is holding is Timaeus, his most theologically infused work, which defines his craftsman, or to use Aristotle's term, the unmoved mover. The Stoics incorporate Plato's theism of the craftsman into their cosmology, and this is why Platonism and Stoicism became so influential on the early Christian fathers. Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, and Augustine were all experienced in Greek philosophy, particularly Stoicism and Platonism, which they used in their writings to justify the truth of Christianity. The head of the Second Academy was a contemporary of Pyrrho's student Timon, named Arcesilaus, who brought skepticism into the school, and they became known as academic skeptics. And the academic skeptics like to play devil's advocate with their own arguments to seek and correct flaws in their logic. The head of the Third Academy, Carneades, was famous for this tactic, and he stunned the Roman Senate around 155 BCE when he spent the first day arguing the merits of justice and his second day arguing the opposite. Carneades was a moderating influence on the skepticism that marked the second or middle period with their focus of not establishing what was true, but in the search for truth. Carneades believed that some objective truths could be known, and it was unnecessary to argue ad infinitum, being pedantic and constantly splitting hairs. The academic skeptics directed many of their arguments at Stoic conceptions of divinity, resulting in a famous thought experiment that aimed to show there is no clear delineation between what is divine and what is not. That thought experiment is known as the heap paradox, where skeptics proposed that adding or taking away a single grain does not change the status of whether the pile can be called a heap or not. Then they applied this logic to the gods. For example, Poseidon is the god of the sea, but in Greek mythology there were also gods associated with rivers. The skeptics argued, where does one draw the dividing line between one amount of water and another? What about a babbling brook, or a seasonal flood, or a puddle? How much or little water determines its status? The skeptics concluded, it's just water. Then we get to Cicero, the Roman statesman and self-professed academic skeptic. The rediscovery of his Republican letters in the mid-1300s by the father of Renaissance humanism, Petrarch, was very influential on Renaissance humanism, especially regarding the topic of moral governance, which was a prime concern of the humanists. Renaissance humanism does not have the modern connotations of secular humanism, as these were devout Christians. Humanism was a way to distinguish their focus on topics of human concern, like grammar and rhetoric, from theologians who studied the divine. Cicero's letters on moral governance would also be influential on Jefferson. Jumping back to Epicurus for a moment, in an unfortunate choice of wording, he described ataraxia not as tranquility, but as pleasure, and here, in his letter to Menicius, Epicurus clearly states what he means, the absence of pain and trouble in the soul. Yet he was intuitive enough to realize his choice of pleasure would be taken out of context by ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. Think for a moment what word is still used in English to describe someone who takes pleasure in food and wine: an Epicurean. And so, who willfully misrepresented Epicurus? None other than his fellow Pyrrhonian skeptic Cicero, who should have known that Epicurus was defining tranquility, yet threw his fellow skeptic under the bus anyway. Then we come to the 2nd century satirist Lucian, who makes clear his Epicurean leanings in Alexander the False Prophet. Epicurus discerns right ideals and handed them down, refutes certain falsehoods, and confirming certain truths. Philosophically, Lucian was not aligned with any specific school, though some scholars consider him a Pyrrhonian skeptic, particularly because of what he wrote in Hermotimus, in which he rejects all philosophical systems on the grounds that they are mutually contradictory and thus cannot all be right. Life is too short to discover which of them is nearest to the truth, so the wisest course is to suspend judgment and be happy. If, like me, you love satire and are irreligious, you will love Zeus Rants, in which Lucian hilariously destroys the Stoic arguments for the gods using Epicurean skepticism, while the Olympian gods observe and lament their coming irrelevance to humanity. Here we can see a ridiculously absurd Stoic syllogism. This is not philosophy, but special pleading. One may reasonably honor the gods, but those who are non-existent one may not reasonably honor. Therefore, gods exist. A point which is countered with a satirical Epicurean rebuttal. The wise one may reasonably honor, but one may not reasonably honor the non-existent. Therefore, wise men exist, which conclusion was unpleasing to the Stoics, as their wise man has remained indiscoverable up till now. Lucian is one of the world's first massively popular influencers, and his literary skepticism shows up in the thinking of many writers in the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and beyond, starting with Erasmus. Incidentally, in Erasmus's disputes with Martin Luther, Erasmus employed Pyrrhonian skepticism to challenge Luther, who was dogmatically asserting the truth of predestination and free will. Erasmus says, "Whoa, Marty, you can't dogmatically assert the truth of anything. You can only approach what may be probably true." Lucian also influences More's Utopia, and Erasmus and More were good friends, united in their shared love of Lucian. Lucian also influences Jonathan Swift, Cyrano de Bergerac, Raspe, Shakespeare, Voltaire, and Nietzsche. Then we arrive at the early 3rd century CE with the most important philosophical disciple of Pyrrhonist thought, Sextus Empiricus. Sextus is important for many reasons, as he is critically important in the transmission of the ideas of philosophical atheism from classical antiquity, particularly with influencing others with skeptical reservations of judgment. In fact, he is the only skeptic from classical antiquity whose writings made it to the Renaissance. Sextus was rediscovered in the mid-1500s by the Renaissance humanists who went looking for philosophical skepticism to refute Catholic scholasticism and the dogmatic certainties in the fights between Catholics and Protestants. Remember the Sunyata of Mahayana Buddhism. Some scholars speculate Sextus may have been the influence for the development of Mahayana Buddhism, as his writings so closely parallel the tenets of this school. Or it may be that, as Sextus was a Pyrrhonian purist, perhaps his writings are just closer to the early Buddhism that developed into the Mahayana school. Perhaps future scholarship will uncover the links. Sextus left the most complete set of skeptical arguments for philosophical atheism, stressing the importance of having no beliefs one way or the other, as tranquility is attainable in the search for knowledge, not in the certainty that one has acquired it. Sextus details the philosophical differences between 3 different groups: the dogmatists, the academics, and the Pyrrhonists in his Outlines of Pyrrhonism. The dogmatists claim to have found the truth, the academics claim truth can never be truly established, and Pyrrhonists, the true skeptics, never stop searching for truth as a tenet of not forming a fixed opinion. By having no belief about an issue, to be skeptical of some so-called truth opens the path to tranquility by suspending judgment. And so Buddhism, as the basis of Greek skepticism, went on to influence many others. particularly the central figure of 16th century French philosophical skepticism, Montaigne, who was deeply influenced by Sextus. Montaigne explicitly endorsed Pyrrhonian skepticism and especially the suspension of judgment with his famous maxim, "What do I know?" Further, Montaigne was very influential in the thinking of others including Descartes, Voltaire, Bayle, and Hume. Anyone familiar with Spinoza will know how influential Descartes was on his thinking, and this is one way in which Buddhist skepticism was transmitted to him. But there's a second lineage of Buddhist Pyrrhonist thought that was transmitted to Spinoza, and that was through the Roman poet who captured the philosophy of Epicurus in Latin prose, Lucretius, in his opus On the Nature of Things. Now, here's where history gets interesting, because On the Nature of Things was lost for centuries until it was rediscovered in a German monastery in 1417. The Renaissance had already been underway for a few decades by 1417, and the rediscovery was like throwing gasoline on the intellectual fires of the era because it added a healthy dose of skeptical inquiry to Renaissance pursuits. If you're interested in the rediscovery of On the Nature of Things and its effects, note the subtitle, How the World Became Modern, I would recommend you read The Swerve. The story behind the man and his mission is quite interesting. However, key to this story is that Epicurus via Lucretius heavily influenced not only Jefferson centuries later, but Machiavelli, and particularly his Republican treatise, Discourses on Livy, a book which was influential on Spinoza's call for secular republican democracies. So, there were two ways in which Buddhism was transmitted to Spinoza, via Epicurus through Lucretius and Machiavelli, and from Pyrrho's disciple Sextus Empiricus through Montaigne and Descartes. There are two other Buddhist via Epicurean clues in Spinoza's thinking. In his letter 56, Spinoza states, "I would have been amazed if you had mentioned Epicurus, Democritus, Lucretius, or any of the defenders of atoms." It was Professor Vardalecus who pointed me to this admission, which is rather cryptic. Vardalecus pointed out that it was dangerous to be an Epicurean in that era, so his allegiance to Epicurus needed to be covert. The danger derived from the cosmology of Epicurus, in which he postulated that gods existed, but that they were made of atoms or matter, like everything else in the universe. As such, when we die, our consciousness goes too, so there is no soul. In fact, the Hebrew word for atheist or heretic is Epikuros, because of his denial of a soul. Therefore, he wasn't too popular with Christian authorities. The second clue comes from the preface to Spinoza's Ethics 5. My ethics, which is concerned with the way leading to freedom, how far the reason can control the emotions, and what is the nature of mental freedom or blessedness. The two core Pyrrhonist concepts are blatantly obvious here, and they appear repeatedly throughout much of Spinoza's writings as transmitted via Epicureanism. One other point, Spinoza writes in one of his letters that he was setting aside ethics to write the TTP to pave the way for the reception of ethics, as society wasn't ready to hear it. However, the TTP generated so much outrage that he did not publish Ethics, and it was only released by his friends upon his death. One reason why it's an Epicurean lineage and not Stoic is because the two cosmologies are clearly different. While Epicurus believed in the gods, his later followers essentially did away with them altogether, but the Stoics were openly theistic. Though the two core ethics are the same for both schools, the divergence in cosmology traces back through Epicurus. As to why there is a direct link from Sextus to Hobbes, once again has to do with Renaissance humanism. The humanists pushed for the reassertion of the literature of classical antiquity, and Hobbes was highly learned in the classics and could speak Greek and Latin. In fact, he translated a Greek play before entering university. And Hobbes knew the writings of Sextus intimately, as is recognizable in his most famous quote from Leviathan, "The life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Hobbes is clearly paraphrasing Sextus in his arguments for social contract theory, which he did not create, but once again he picked up from the ancient Greeks, as Sextus was noting in this passage. Briefly, social contract theory derives from the Greeks speculating that at the dawn of humanity we were primal and some clever man thought up the gods as a cosmic babysitter to help people behave. As we became more civilized and had established rulers, the social contract was that we, the citizens, gave up certain freedoms to avoid anarchy, and Hobbes is noticeably using the philosophical skepticism of Sextus to make his case. Via Sextus and his influence on Montaigne, Hobbes, and others, Buddhist reservations of judgment in the form of Greek skepticism fueled the Renaissance and sparked the Enlightenment. So we can see how Buddha, who rejected the gods, karma, afterlife also came to influence many others with his refusal to condone absolutes, which has led several others to use skeptical arguments to dethrone religion. Can we say that Buddhist ideals led to secular societies? I think we can see a clear chain of causality that Buddhism helped bequeath our modern secular societies through the arguments of Greek skeptics, which were rediscovered by later Renaissance humanists and used in the arguments of Hobbes and Spinoza, who influenced the 18th century Enlightenment. Now, if you will indulge me one last tangent, there is another very interesting link between Epicurus and Empiricus. I am sure most have seen this trilemma attributed to Epicurus. Further, I can guarantee no one on the planet has ever seen a citation given, and there are several reasons why. 1, he didn't write it. 2, as we know, he believed in the gods. And 3, he thought atheists were insane. Where Epicurus names and shames the atheists of his era I got from Cambridge Classics professor David Sedley, which you can see in this recent video I did on my YouTube channel. Remember I said Montaigne influenced both Bayle and Hume? Would anyone like to guess who formulated the English translation of the trilemma? It was Hume in Part 10 of his Dialogues, and Hume is also considered by some scholars to be a Pyrrhonian skeptic. But Hume got it from Bayle's Historical and Critical Dictionary, which we saw earlier is where Spinoza was claimed to be a Stoic. But Bayle gives us the person who made this false attribution, an early Christian apologist named Lactantius in his On the Anger of God. The book is an attack on Epicurean arguments, so maybe it just suited his agenda to attribute it to Epicurus. One last related tangent, Lactantius is responsible for transmitting another fabrication to us across the ages, one version of Constantine's Battle of Milvian Bridge, and the story of the "by this sign you will conquer" omen. Lactantius was a contemporary of Constantine the Great, and he recorded his version within a few years of the battle, where Constantine had a dream of the Chi, which was an early Christian symbol of the first 2 letters for spelling Christ in Greek. The story of a vision of a cross in the sky came decades later in the life of Constantine by Eusebius of Caesarea, which shows us that Constantine never let truth get in the way of a good story as his embellishments grew over time. So, if the trilemma did not come from Epicurus, it must have come from Sextus, and here it is in Outlines of Pyrrhonism, which I said we'd come back to. Did Lactantius just mix up similar-sounding names, Epicurus and Empiricus? Who knows? Therefore, it was a skeptical philosopher documenting Pyrrhonist or Buddhist thinking who wrote this popular maxim, not Epicurus. Incidentally, if you ask ChatGPT who wrote the trilemma, it will point you to this citation, which I added as part of my preparation for this presentation. Thank you all for coming. Why didn't I cover Socrates if the philosophy of classical antiquity was so important to Spinoza? Well, let me recall the first part of Spinoza's letter 56. The authority of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates is not worth much to me. Additionally, Professor David Sedley notes in his Creationism and its Critics in Antiquity that Socrates formulated the argument from design to refute the atomists, such as Democritus and the later Epicurus. Further, Bertrand Russell was highly critical of Socrates and his methods in A History of Western Philosophy. What about the similarities of Spinoza to Zhuangzi? Excellent question. Brooke Ziporian discusses this in Spinoza and the Self-Overcoming of Solipsism, and he is one of the 3 scholars that Hong Ladaram mentioned. Sorry I don't recall the details, but I covered it in my book, and you can find the specifics in his paper.